Hello, folks. Devin Palouse, Ratio, Christi, and Winthrop University. We are live, and we are hiding out in the bunker here in Rock Hill, better known as Rock Hill Bible Fellowship Church, which is the church I attend. And today, my friend Mike is going to be speaking on the problem of evil. Now, everything going on with the coronavirus, as we all know, has definitely caused a lot of issues, right? From schools closing, and restaurants, etc., gyms. And so, we could do a couple things. We could just give up, lie down and die. But we're not going to do that. We worked very hard this semester. My wife especially worked very hard this semester to get this curriculum, the series that we've been doing together this particular semester. We've been looking at theology and apologetics, how exactly apologetics and theology go together. What are some theological issues where it intersects with apologetics? Last semester, you guys may remember, I did a debate against a fellow campus minister with the Young Advocates for Christ on whether Jesus was fully God or not. And so that's a good example of how these issues intersect. And so we're going to continue with the semester. We're going to keep going. Winthrop right now, they're being smart like the other schools. They're not meeting. And so we're basically here in a pretty empty room with just me and my colleague. And we are going to continue what would be on our normal schedule. And that would be the problem of evil. We're a few hours earlier today than we normally do it. But this video, of course, will be on YouTube, and we will upload it to YouTube, and of course it's here on Facebook. And so we're going to continue with our series. Pastor Ware, who's been with us and has done a few talks, he's publicly has come out and kind of let people know that his wife hasn't been feeling well, and so they're kind of self-quarantining, and so some of his talks he's not going to be able to do just with this whole thing going on. He's going to have to do a lot more church services. So we're going to have to improvise a little bit, but the semester is going to continue. We're going to keep talking about theology and apologetics now more than ever. Why? Because the world needs it, and because we've been commissioned, and you can't stop being the church just because the world's going crazy. So, with that said, I'm going to go ahead and switch over to my friend Mike Bost. Today, we're going to be looking at the problem of evil. This was planned out months before this thing with the coronavirus even happened. So it's unfortunately good timing, but I would say more of divine providence. So, Brother Mike, I'm going to hand it over to you.
All right, thanks, Devin. All right, great. So yes, our discussion tonight is going to be the problem of evil. And if you've been in Christianity any amount of time, you probably are aware that the problem of evil is one of the greatest objections that's raised against the knowledge of God. It's also one of the most sensitive and difficult topics that we can discuss, especially as Christians. Okay, even Christians struggle with this question. This is not just something that skeptics throw out. This is something that Christians, if you've really thought about your faith, it's something that most of us have probably struggled with. And all of us have experience with evil and suffering. And we should be open to the difficulty of talking about this topic and do our best to answer it when the question arises. So let me go over the outline here. Some of the things we're going to talk about. We're going to look at the objection itself, defining evil, accounting for evil, and then we'll look at answering the logical problem of evil, the evidential problem of evil, the emotional problem of evil, and then lastly, we'll wrap it up with keeping a Christian perspective on the problem of evil. And some of these things, if you're not, and also I wanted to mention, this is an introductory kind of discussion of the problem of evil. There's so much written on this topic. Philosophical documents, theological documents, so much is written. This is really, if we had our full class here for Ratio Christi, this might be the first time that some of these students would have ever kind of heard about this topic. So we're going to keep it at an introductory level. There's so much more that could be said, but We're going to keep it at that introductory level. But I'll give you a good resource at the end as well that can be for further reading and study. Okay, well, this problem of evil, this is not something new. It actually goes back quite a ways. And if you've looked at the problem of evil, someone that usually comes up with one of the first people to kind of have this riddle about the problem of evil is someone called Epicurus, a Greek philosopher. And he came up with, I suppose you could consider it a riddle. It says, is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he is not omnipotent. He's not all-powerful. Is he able but not willing? Then he is malevolent. He's not all good. Is he both able and willing? Then whence cometh evil? If he's neither able nor willing, then why call him God? Okay? So the objection of the problem of evil attempts to pit God's attributes against the existence of evil. God's attributes of being all-powerful, all-good, and all-knowing. Okay? A modern version of this might go something like this. If God is all-loving, he would prevent evil. If God is all-powerful, he could prevent evil. If God is all-knowing, he knows how to prevent evil. Since we know that evil exists, it is logically impossible for an all-loving, all-powerful, all-knowing God to exist. So again, attempting to pit God's attributes and the existence of evil against each other and saying that it is simply logically impossible that God could exist based on the presence of evil in the world. So that is the objection. We're going to answer that a little later, but let's look at a few helpful distinctions with regard to the problem of evil. You can break it broadly into two categories: the intellectual problem of evil and the emotional problem of evil. The intellectual problem of evil concerns how to give a rational explanation of God and evil, the existence of God and the existence of evil. This falls in the realm, the province of the philosopher. The emotional problem of evil is different. It concerns how to comfort or console someone who is suffering and how to dissolve the emotional dislike they might have for a God who would allow such evil. This is more the province of a pastor, a counselor, someone like that, okay? We're going to look at that as well. So broadly, you've got two main aspects of the problem of evil. Now, the intellectual problem of evil can further be broken down into two other categories: the logical problem of evil and the evidential problem of evil. The logical problem of evil is what we just looked at a minute ago, to claim that it is logically impossible for God and evil to exist. Pitting God's attributes against each other with the existence of evil and saying God cannot exist. The evidential problem says, given the amount of evil in the world, it is highly improbable that God exists. So it's not going as far as saying it's impossible for God to exist. It's saying it's highly unlikely that God exists because of the amount of evil that's in the world. And again, we'll look at these a little more in depth later. I just wanted to lay out the objections, and we'll answer these a little later in the talk here. Oh, going back. So with the logical problem of evil, if this can be established that it's impossible for God to exist, well, that's obviously devastating for Christianity and any other theistic religion. But if we can show that they don't conflict, that it's just possible that God and evil exist, then we've answered the objection. Okay? There are different ways to tackle this problem, but logically, if it's not actually contradictory, if we find that it is in fact possible that God and evil exist, then we've answered the objection. And we'll do that a little later. So what is evil? Okay, it is obvious, it is evidentially clear that evil exists in the world. But what do we mean by evil? How do we know what evil is? Okay, let's take a closer look.
Quick question.
Yes.
We actually have a number of people watching. If they wanted to ask a question after the talk, would you want me to read the question to you?
I'll do my best.
Okay. Do you want to let them know if afterwards, if they want to ask a question?
Okay, sure. Yes, so Devin was just saying, I'm not sure if you heard that, but apparently some people are watching this, which is great. If you want to ask some questions, I guess type them in and Devin will let me know. I'll do my best to attempt to answer them. Okay, so what is evil? Okay. So by saying that something is evil in the world, one is actually admitting that there's a standard to measure this by. There's some standard, okay? Otherwise, how do we know what's evil? Okay, to know something is wrong, we have to know first that something is right. So how do we know? What is this standard that people are using to measure this, whether something is good or evil? Okay. Well, there's no way to get from statements about how the world is, just how it is, to how it ought to be without some kind of a value system, without some way to measure this, without some kind of dividing line. Okay. We can describe how things are, but how do we describe how things ought to be? C.S. Lewis, once an atheist in his life, he looked at this problem, and when he looked back on his atheism after becoming a Christian, he says this. He says, "My argument against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has an idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust?" So Lewis recognized the same problem I was just mentioning. There must be some kind of a standard, some unit, some way to measure, some value system to call something just or unjust, straight or crooked. Okay? And when someone offers the objection that God can't exist because of the evil in the world, the first question as a tactic that I would say you should ask is, what do you mean by evil? Okay, make them define evil. And this is what you're probably going to get. The person most likely will give you examples of evil: rape, murder, theft, lying, cheating on your spouse, things like that. But is that actually defining evil, or is it just giving examples of evil? Okay, I would argue that those are just examples of evil. But what is evil? Okay, you can give examples, but why is that evil? Why is rape evil? You're not actually telling me what evil is. You're just giving examples. So when we look at defining evil, a good way to look at it is evil is a departure from the way things ought to be. It's a departure from the way things ought to be. It is a corruption, a deviation, or a lack from some standard of good. That's a good definition of evil. And then, of course, all those examples would fall under that we mentioned earlier. But think about it. So if there is a standard of good, so let's say a good car, for example, a good car should not have rust. The fact that a car has rust is some corruption, a deviation from a standard of good, okay? A human cell should not have cancer. A good cell doesn't have cancer. A cell with cancer has some corruption in it. We can have roads without holes in them. A good road has no potholes, okay? A road with a pothole is not a good road. It's fallen from the standard of a good road. Same thing with wood. Wood should not have rot, okay? So, I mean, we get this idea of falling short of some standard, okay, when comparing to something as a standard of good. So an objection that you might hear is, if God created all things and evil is a thing, then didn't God create evil? Well, if we define evil in the sense that it is a corruption or a privation, a departure, evil itself is actually a lack of something. It's a lack of being rather than having an essence of its own. Evil cannot exist without some good. So we can have roads without holes, but if you took the hole out of a road, you don't have anything. There's nothing there, okay? It's just a privation, it's a corruption of the road. So to answer this objection, evil is not actually a thing. It doesn't have an essence on its own. It doesn't exist all by itself. It exists as a corruption or privation of some good thing, and therefore it doesn't actually exist apart from good. Okay? You can't have rot, just rot. Rot has to be on something. It has to be on something good. Okay, so I just wanted to throw that in there as a possible objection that you might hear, and a way to answer it. Okay. All worldviews must address the problem of evil. People seem to assume that the problem of evil is only a problem if you believe in God. Actually, it's a problem for everyone. Okay? The problem of evil is not just a problem for Christians. It's a problem for all worldviews. So if someone throws out the objection of the problem of evil, don't just let someone demand an explanation from your worldview as a Christian unless they're willing to explain it from their own worldview. Okay, so let's look at a few examples of how maybe other worldviews have to grapple with the problem of evil before we get to Christianity. So Eastern religions, that would be Buddhism, Hinduism, those types of religions. Well, in Eastern religions, evil and suffering are not even considered real, but merely illusions. Okay, they ascribe to something called monism, and their view of ultimate reality is that ultimate reality is beyond all differentiation and distinctions. So ultimately, there is no good and evil. There are no distinctions in Eastern religions. Yet we know, as humans, we see and experience evil and suffering all the time. So to deny that evil exists, it really is simply irrational. Okay? Imagine this scenario. Someone is raped. So imagine having to tell the victim of a rape that the so-called evil that you endured is merely a false impression, an illusion, because you're ignorant to the interdependency and interconnectedness of all things. You fail to realize that the distinction you make between good and evil is merely the product of your unenlightened mind. If you follow this to its logical conclusion, this is what you'd have to conclude with Eastern religions, since they make no distinctions or differentiations once they've attained full enlightenment. Okay? This solution doesn't really take the problem of evil seriously, and it's further evidence that against these types of worldviews that advocate it. What about atheism? The type of atheism I'm talking about here is atheism, naturalism. Naturalism being the worldview that regards just the natural, material, and physical universe as the only reality. Okay? That everything, the worldview that says nothing exists but matter and energy interacting according to the laws of physics and chemistry. So let's look at how atheism, naturalism might have to deal with the problem of evil. Well, first off, it's impossible for mere matter and energy to make anything morally right or morally wrong. How could it? How is it possible for impersonal, natural processes to produce any type of moral truths, values, or duties? If it's just matter and energy interacting with the laws of physics and chemistry, how can that make anything right or wrong? That just simply is. It just is. Which is the next bullet there, I'm sorry. It can only make what is, not what should be or shouldn't be. Okay? So when atheists complain about evil, they presuppose a standard of good, the way things ought to be. But on their own worldview, how are they actually grounding that? I mean, how does the laws of physics and chemistry make anything morally right or wrong? Okay? I'm not saying they can't complain. I'm saying they're having a problem grounding their objection to the way things ought to be. Because in naturalism, there only is. Nature just is. So where are they getting this standard? So consider this. On atheism and naturalism, if you want to call anything evil at all, child molestation, rape, slavery, racism, terrorism, school shootings, sex trafficking, opioid dealing, whatever, it can only get you as far as saying you don't prefer it, because you can't ground it in atheism. Or you can say your culture doesn't prefer it, or it isn't conducive to human flourishing. but you can't actually ground it objectively because nature just is. Okay? It cannot actually get you as far as saying that something is actually right or wrong. So in the atheistic view, human beings, we're just highly advanced and evolved animals. And animals actually don't have any moral obligations to each other. When a lion kills a zebra, the lion does not murder the zebra. He simply kills the zebra. When a great white shark forcibly copulates with a female, that great white shark is not raping that female, it's simply forcibly copulating with her. Okay? They're just animals. There are no moral dimensions to these actions in just a naturalistic world. So on naturalism, there is no moral dimensions because animals are not moral agents. And by extension, if we, in atheism, are just highly evolved animals, where are we grounding our sense of right and wrong? It's very difficult to do in atheism. Richard Dawkins recognized this. Here's a quote along these same lines. He gets it, actually. He says, in a universe of blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt, and other people are going to get lucky, and you won't find any rhyme or reason to it, nor any justice. The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is, at the bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good. Nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. DNA neither knows nor cares. DNA just is, and we dance to its music. So, going back to the rape example, imagine having to tell the victim of a rape that her attacker, he didn't really do anything wrong, but he was just simply dancing to his DNA. Not very comforting, not very reassuring. It doesn't really provide an answer to the problem of evil. Oh, I'm sorry. So, when we look at atheism, there really is no grounding to call any act right or wrong, evil or good, without some kind of transcendent standard of goodness to compare it against. Paul Copan, apologist and philosopher, he says, how do we make sense of evil if naturalism is true? After all, why should things be any different than they are? Atheists using the argument from evil are assuming a standard of goodness, but where does this standard come from? If we're simply random byproducts of mindless, valueless processes that we can't really call then we can't really call something evil, even if we may not like it. In the end, the atheist must grapple not only with the problem of evil, but also with the problem of goodness. If a standard of goodness exists from which evil is a deviation, then we're pointed in the direction of God. And ironically, people point to the existence of evil as an argument against God, but you can actually flip this on its head and say that evil actually proves that God exists. Why? Well, if the universe is impersonal, as we've been discussing, then morality is socially constructed with no basis in objectivity, something beyond someone's mere, preferences or opinions. So without some kind of transcendent standard of goodness, beyond human opinion and preferences, then no one can rightfully claim that it's objectively wrong to do anything. So where does this objective standard of goodness come from? The only suitable grounding for objective morality is an objective lawgiver, moral lawgiver, God. All right, so back to the worldviews again. We looked at Eastern religions, atheism and naturalism, how they would address the problem of evil. What about Christians? Isn't that why we all tuned in for this? Okay. So the Christian faith is committed to both the reality of evil and the reality of an omnipotent, omniscient, and all-loving God. The skeptic, however, as we've already noted, says this is inconsistent. Since evil exists, it follows logically that God cannot exist. That's what the skeptics claim. So, how do we as Christians handle this apparent dilemma? As Christians, we don't pass off suffering as an illusion, meaningless, product of karma, anything that can be avoided. we correctly acknowledge the existence of evil and the existence of an omnipotent, omniscient, and all-loving God. So how do we do this? All right, so now we're getting to where we can actually answer the logical problem of evil. So let's look. So just as a review, if God is all-loving, he would prevent evil. If he's all-powerful, he could prevent evil. If God is all-knowing, he knows how to prevent evil. Since we know evil exists, it's logically impossible for an all-loving, all-powerful, all-knowing God to exist. So again, to defeat the logical problem of evil, we only need to provide a possible solution to the proposition. Now, there are different ways to handle this, but we only need to provide a possible way. And if it's possible that God and evil could exist, we've answered the logical problem of evil. So consider a paperclip. If I were to give someone a paperclip, and I gave them a few minutes, and I said, fashion it into the shape of a triangle, they could probably, it doesn't take great strength to manipulate a paperclip. After a minute or so, they could probably make it into a triangle. If I then said, okay, turn that paperclip into a square, a few more minutes, they could probably manipulate it, turn it into a square. Now, if I gave them another task and said, can you make this into a four-sided triangle? A four-sided triangle, would they be able to do that? No. Is it because they don't have the strength to do it? No. Could God do it? God is all-powerful. Could God make a paperclip into a four-sided triangle? No. Why? Well, a four-sided triangle is not a thing. It's just an inconsistent combination of words. Okay? So, when we say that God can't turn a paperclip into a four-sided triangle, that's not any argument against God's omnipotence, his all-powerfulness, because God does not do logical contradictions. A four-sided triangle is not a thing. It's an inconsistent combination of words. So when we look at omnipotence, being all-powerful, it does not mean that God can act contrary to his own character and nature. Okay, there are some things that God can't do. He cannot lie. He cannot cease to exist. He can't swear to anyone greater than himself. These aren't lacks of God's essence and nature. They simply fall into his being and character. Additionally, this is what we just talked about. Being all-powerful does not mean that he can do logical impossibilities. He can't create a four-sided triangle. He can't create a married bachelor, a one-ended stick, or two trees, each taller than the other. Why? Because these things don't exist. They are logical impossibilities. They're simply an inconsistent combination of words. They're not really things at all. So again, going back to C.S. Lewis, he recognized this. He says, meaningless combination of words do not suddenly acquire meaning simply because we prefix to the two other words God can. Okay? Just because we say God can create a four-sided triangle, that doesn't make any sense because it's just an inconsistent combination of words. It's not really a thing at all. So omnipotence properly defined, when Christians say that God is all-powerful and can do all things, we mean that God can do anything that is logically possible. Contradictions, logical impossibilities, they don't qualify. So here's a question. Is it logically possible to make someone freely choose to do something? Can you make someone freely choose to do something? Well, if you cause someone to make a specific choice, then the choice is no longer free. It's just an inconsistent combination of words. It's like a four-sided triangle. If you cause someone to make a free decision, that's contradictory. It doesn't make sense. So what about God? Can he make someone freely choose to do something? Can God create free moral agents and guarantee that they will never choose to use their freedom wrongly? So again, we're leading up to a possible, an answer to the logical problem of evil by presenting a possible solution to this. Alvin Plantinga, a Christian philosopher, asked this question as well in his book, God, Freedom, and Evil, about can God create free moral agents and guarantee that they will never misuse their freedom. So here's what Plantinga had to say about it. It's a longer quote, but I want to read the whole thing. He says, now God can create free creatures, but he can't cause or determine them to do only what is right. For if he does so, then they aren't significantly free after all, and they do not do what is right freely. To create creatures capable of moral good, therefore he must create creatures capable of moral evil. And he can't give these creatures the freedom to perform evil and at the same time prevent them from doing so. As it turned out, sadly, some of the free creatures God created went wrong in the exercise of their freedom. This is the source of moral evil. The fact that free creatures sometimes go wrong, however, counts neither against God's omnipotence nor against his goodness, for he could have forestalled the occurrence of moral evil only by removing the possibility of moral good. That's a lot to take in. To kind of summarize it, it follows then that evil was not created by God, but came about as the result of God's creatures' misuse of their free will. There is no logical inconsistency involved when God, although wholly good, creates a world of free creatures who choose to do evil. Yes?
Got a question for you from Paul. Paul is asking, he says, well, it's a logical impossibility to be 100% man and 100% God at the same time. Is it not? So if Jesus can be God and man, then couldn't he break the laws of logic? And is that a breaking of the laws of logic?
That gets into the question of the Trinity and the hypostatic union. I don't really want to get on that topic right now. I would say it's not a logical impossibility, but unless you wanted to add something, but I don't want to get side.
Just it's on our YouTube channel, the talk we did on the Trinity and the deity of Jesus, but it's not a logical contradiction because it's two different natures.
Yes. So we, as Devin was saying, we have done a talk on this earlier in the semester, specifically on the Trinity and the hypostatic union. It's not a contradiction because it's two different natures. There is the human nature and a divine nature, and the two don't actually conflict with each other because they're different natures altogether. But I would refer you to our talk on that.
Ratio Christi, Winthrop, YouTube.
Ratio Christi, Winthrop University on YouTube. Thank you for the question. So Clay Jones, in his book, Why Does God Allow Evil? Highly recommended, very good book, very readable at a layman's level. But he gives an example along these lines. He says, you can't tell your daughter she's free to go out with the boy down the street and then chain her to the oven and say that, she can't go out. Okay, you can't say that she's free to do that, but then not allow her to go out. That's kind of the concept that Plantinga is getting at. Okay, if we create a free creature, we can't guarantee that they may never misuse that free will, and to do otherwise would be would mean that they're not actually free. Okay. So again, that's one possible answer to the logical problem of evil. Let's move on to the evidential problem of evil. So in this case, the skeptic concedes that the existence of God and evil, it is logically possible. They'll concede that. But they'll say, given the amount of evil in the world, it's highly improbable that God exists. God simply allows too much evil, so that counts against him, and therefore it's highly unlikely that he exists. So how do we answer this? Well, the assumption presupposes that God cannot have any morally sufficient reasons for permitting the kinds of evil that exist in the world. But is this assumption true? Not necessarily. We also have to wonder how much reduction in evil would satisfy the skeptic. What evils would they do away with? The bad stuff? The really bad stuff? Where is the dividing line? What is an acceptable amount of evil? Okay? What would have been an acceptable amount of evil for the Holocaust? We know that 6 million Jews were killed in the Holocaust. What would be an acceptable amount? 600,000? 60,000? 6,000? Where do we draw the line? What is an acceptable amount of evil? What about the Twin Towers, 9/11? Would we have been satisfied if only one of the towers had fallen instead of both? Where do we draw the line? What is an acceptable amount of evil? Okay, none of us, we don't really think in these terms. I mean, we may say that, but then when we really think about it, where do we draw the line? We want all evil reduced. We want all evil done away with. We want it eradicated completely. So let's look at the objection again. It presupposes that God cannot have any morally sufficient reasons for permitting the kinds of evil that exist in the world. Greg Koukl, in his book, The Story of Reality, gives an example, a thought experiment. He calls it the Commando and the gas chambers. He says, imagine a commando in World War II who is dropped behind enemy lines, posing as a German officer so he can get into a concentration camp and destroy the gas chambers. Imagine next that as he mingles with other officers, he sees a soldier preparing to execute a prisoner. This is an evil that he could stop simply by shooting the soldier. But at what cost? He might save one person, but his mission is to save many by destroying the gas chambers. So do we fault this commando? He could have saved the prisoner from being executed. So do we fault him for not doing so? Well, he had a sufficient reason for not doing so because his mission was what? It was to actually destroy the gas chambers to save even more lives. Okay, we intuitively understand this. With our children, for example, do they understand why we give them vaccinations, for example, or why they may have to undergo a surgery at a young age? Anyone who's had any dental work understands sometimes you have to go through pain, but we understand it's acceptable because it's for a greater good. So the fact is that in many cases, we humans allow pain and suffering to occur in a person's life to bring about some greater good because we have sufficient reasons for allowing it. So we understand this intuitively as humans, that we allow some pain, some suffering, because there's a greater good. So what about God? So as finite persons, we are limited in time and space, intelligence and insight. So when we apply this to God, well, the fact that I can't figure out why God might allow some certain evil to occur, that doesn't warrant the conclusion that God has no reasons for doing so, or worse, that he doesn't exist at all. Okay? For the skeptic to argue that it would be impossible for God to have any reason for ever allowing evil, that's quite a burden to take on. So God may permit some evil in the present to bring about a greater good in the future. God is omniscient, we are not. We do not have the whole picture of what's going on in our world. God does. And he may have insight, he may have perspective that we do not have. We have biblical examples of this. In Genesis 50, consider Joseph. We all know his story. He was kidnapped by his brothers, sold into slavery, okay, went to Egypt. All these evils occurred to him, spent time in prison. And yet at the very end, what happens? He says to his brothers, as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. Joseph had no idea all that was going to happen. He only had his limited perspective. And yet, these evils that occurred in his life were actually used for an ultimate good. Consider the crucifixion and death of Jesus. Same thing. Probably the greatest evil that has ever occurred in human history has mounted in the greatest good, the salvation of souls and eternal life for those who believe. But at the time, the disciples, they did not really understand all that was going on. Okay, they had a limited perspective. So again, we're just looking as a possible answer to this objection, and it seems we have biblical examples, and we all understand this intuitively, even as humans, that it may be possible and reasonable to allow suffering and pain to allow some kind of a greater good. Now, something else I want to mention is that when we look at the problem of evil just in isolation, if we just looked at the horrors of the world simply in isolation, it might seem, wow, that doesn't really bode well for God. I mean, look at all the evil in the world. But is that the only evidence that we have for or against God's existence? Actually, no. So we could say, well, does God exist? Well, if you said no, we could put evil in the no category. But what about the yes category? These are arguments and subjects that we study at Ratio Christi from time to time. Okay, it's part of our curriculum. But we look at the beginning of the universe, the design in biology, the design in physics, the fine-tuning of the universe, objective morality, which I hinted at earlier, the laws of logic, the origin of life, mind and consciousness, Old Testament prophecy, and the resurrection of Jesus. All these are evidences for the existence of God. Evil would be evidence that God doesn't exist. So when we take the full scope of evidence, the existence of God actually becomes quite probable. And as I mentioned earlier in the talk, evil can actually be used as an existence for God as well, because it would fall under the objective morality aspect. So just something to keep in mind. Okay, evil is not all there is with regard to God's existence. We have all these other areas that give credibility to the full scope of evidence for God's existence. All right, so moving on to the emotional problem of evil. And again, to review, this concerns how to comfort or console those who are suffering, who are actually going through pain and suffering, how to dissolve emotional dislikes they might have for a God that would allow such evil. And again, this gets into the area of a counselor, a pastor, a pastoral sense, okay, but it's still a very real issue, the emotional problem of evil. Devin will like this because he just skinned his knee today. I should have taken a picture of your knee. So, again, Clay Jones in his book, Why Does God Allow Evil? He gives an example. He says, consider a child who's out running at the playground, slips, falls, skins their knee, runs to his mother for comfort. Now, his mother can do any number of things. She can tell her son that this happened because he was running too fast, he wasn't watching where he was going, and the next time he should be more careful. She could tell him, if she knew, the laws of physics, and explain that the causation, she could explain the laws of physics and causation that were operating to make her son scrape just the shape that it is and the size that it is. And she might even expound for a few moments on the lessons that God is trying to teach her child from this experience. She could say all those things, right? And if she then pauses and says, do you understand, sweetheart? Don't be surprised if the child says, yes, mommy, but it still hurts. Okay? All these logical explanations, they didn't do anything to stop his pain. He didn't need all these discourses and philosophical musings at that moment. He needs his mom's hugs and his mom's kisses. Okay? He needs his mom's sympathy, love, and care at that moment. He doesn't need a bunch of intellectual discourse. Okay? That's what we're talking about with the emotional problem of evil. So what we've been talking about earlier, all these philosophical arguments, solutions for the intellectual problem of evil, they may be of little comfort to someone who is intensely suffering and hurting inside. So what can we say to those who are laboring under the emotional problem of evil? In one sense, the most important thing may not be what you say at all. The most important thing may be to just be there as a loving friend and a sympathetic listener. Okay, we should be there as a source of comfort for someone going through the emotional problem of evil. This is not the time to make the logical problem of evil arguments that we discussed earlier. Because it might seem cold, it might seem dry, uncaring. That's not what this person needs. Think of the little boy. He doesn't need that from his mom. He needs hugs and kisses and comfort and love. So here's a real life example. Johnny Erickson Tada. She became a quadriplegic. Yes, quadriplegic. I always get those mixed up. A quadriplegic when she was 17 years old. She dove into some water, hit some rocks, and severed her spinal cord. And from the age of 17, she's been a quadriplegic. She's since become a Christian author and speaker. Well, she was interviewed with a magazine called, I can't even read it. I don't know the magazine. It was a person called Marvin Alasky. I'm sorry I don't have the magazine. I have the date. Anyway, she was being interviewed for a magazine article, and the interviewer asked her this question. He said, when you were in the hospital in despair about becoming a quadriplegic through your diving accident, were some comments people made with good intentions hugely irritating? And this is what she had to say. She said, I had many well-meaning friends my age who said well-meaning things, but they were uninformed because the Bible says weep with those who weep. Many friends would say to me, from Romans 8:28, Johnny, all things fit together to a pattern of good. Or from James 1:3, welcome this trial as a friend. Or from Romans 5, rejoice in suffering. These are good and right and true biblical mandates, but when your heart is being wrung out like a sponge, sometimes the 16 good biblical reasons as to why all this has happened to you sting like salt in the wound. When people are going through great trauma, great grief, they don't want answers, because answers don't reach the problems where it hurts, in the gut and in the heart. So just advice, I'm not a counselor, but if you have any friends that are going through the emotional problem of evil, this is not the time for logical arguments. Again, she recognizes that their intentions were good, but how does she describe it? It stung like salt in the wound. Okay? They just need you to be there for comfort. You don't even have to say anything. Just be there as a friend, someone who is a shoulder to cry on. Be a good listener, okay? I hope everyone can see the distinction between the emotional problem of evil and the intellectual problem of evil, okay? All right, so keeping a Christian perspective on the problem of evil. Three points to consider. Number one, the world is deeply broken. We understand this, okay? Christians should not be surprised by the evil in the world. On the contrary, we should expect it. And while God allows evil for a time and a purpose, He will ultimately eliminate it. Revelation 21:4. Okay, we understand that sin breaks the relationship between God and human beings. And even the Apostle Paul, he reminds us that even all of creation is groaning and awaits its redemption or its restoration. Okay, the world is broken. This is not a surprise for Christians. We expect this. Point number two, our hope as Christians is not in the temporal things of this world. It's not in our possessions. It's not in our bank account. It's not in a life without pain, sickness, suffering, trial, or tribulation. Okay? None of those things are wrong necessarily to hope for, but our hope is not in those things. Okay? Our hope is in Jesus Christ and Him crucified for our sins. That is the good news, that God sent His Son to solve the problem of evil. Jesus bled, He died for our sins, we're forgiven in Him, we're reconciled to God, and through His resurrection, we are given assurance of eternal life. Okay, we're keeping a Christian perspective on this. Again, our hope is not in temporal things. And if they are in the temporal things of the world, then we've missed the whole point of the cross, okay? The cross assures us that we will have eternal life. We will have eternal health, safety, and security. But those promises are for the eschaton. They're not for now, okay? Those are things that are to come. Keeping a Christian perspective on the problem of evil. Last point, keep an eternal perspective. Keep an eternal perspective. Eternity will ultimately dwarf our sufferings in this life to insignificance. Consider the Apostle Paul, who suffered through floggings and beatings and stonings and shipwrecks and imprisonments, rejection, hunger, thirst, homelessness, and far more pain than most of us will ever have to endure. Okay, 5 times his back was shredded by 39 lashes with a whip. 3 times he was beaten to a bloody pulp by rods. And yet, the Apostle Paul, after all of his sufferings and hardships, he puts his suffering into perspective when he says, from Romans 8:18, he says, I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us. He goes on later in 2 Corinthians to say, for this light momentary affliction is preparing us for an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison. As we look not to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient, but the things that are unseen are eternal. This is the Apostle Paul, again, who endured so many hardships that I just mentioned: floggings, beatings, stonings, shipwrecks, imprisonments, hunger, thirst. And yet he can write with full assurance and confidence about the glory that awaits us. Okay? This should be a great comfort for us as Christians in keeping the problem of evil in perspective. The world is undergoing hard times right now. Many people are sick. Many people are scared. It's okay to be scared, but keep the eternal perspective. Keep a Christian perspective on these things. We know the world is broken. Okay? We know that we're not to put our hope in the temporal things of this world, and we know that we should keep an eternal perspective. Keep those 3 things in mind. That should give us great comfort as Christians as we face the challenges that we're currently facing in our world and the challenges to come. Okay? This too shall pass. But, as we live our lives, we Christians have great hope and assurance of a bodily resurrection, and we'll get into that in a few weeks on another topic. But I would normally say, are there any questions? But there's no one here except Devin. So I hope this, let me make sure there's, yeah, that's all I had. So this concludes the topic, unless was there anything else, Devin?
I think we're good.
Okay. Well, thank you for your attention, and I hope it was helpful.